Morning, everyone. We are on our second day of Life Sciences webinar. Today's topic is on technology that is used as your day-to-day operations, technology used for you to stay compliant, technology used for your cyber diligence, cyber breach, data breach requirements. So with that, we have today Jen Bregman, who is from AtaCor Medical, who's our guest speaker, myself, Alpa Kamdar. I'm the MD who runs the technology practice for Kroll, and Stacy Scott. And the three of us are going to talk about technology that's impacting your day-to-day operations. But before that, we'll do a quick introduction. Stacy, do you wanna give your background a little bit?
Sure, thanks, Alpa. Nice to be here with all of you. Stacy Scott, as Alpa said, I'm in our cyber risk business unit here at Kroll. I've been in cybersecurity for a little over 18 years. Have a background as a chief information security officer, but also running a lot of investigations, and now consult with clients on cyber strategies and cyber and privacy strategies to make sure you're balancing those with business.
Thank you. Jan?
Hi, everybody. My name's Jan Bregman. I'm with AtaCor Medical, and I've been in the medical device industry for over 20 years now. And I've always been in the quality systems aspect, meaning what I do is I'm in a regulatory compliance role. I look at both the domestic and international regulations, and I implement quality systems to help comply with those systems. And recently, in the previous years, the most recent years, each of those systems that I'm implementing is now more heavily technology-based and working on software platforms versus a paper-based system. So as we're integrating to all those new technologies and trying to address regulatory requirements to try to stay compliant. Thank you.
And myself, Alpa Kamdar, I'm part of Kroll's transaction advisory practice and focus on pre and post close, largely on healthcare deals. So that's not only doing the assessment on the target on their systems, but also post close, working with clients like Jen on helping implement technology and making sure that the technologies are compliant for healthcare industries and healthcare clients. So with that, we're going to kick off this session with a polling question that will help us to understand our audience and understand where you are in terms of technology when it comes to your business. So we have 30 seconds for everyone to respond to this question. Okay, and I have 5 more seconds, and then I'm going to move to the results. Wow, this is interesting. This is very nice. Jen, do you want to take this? I think, especially the first engineering and quality testing, which is really what you live and breathe. So we have a lot of our audiences, they have their engineering and quality outside of their system, or probably it's in the paper system or it's manual. So do you want to share your thoughts on, what are the advantages of digitizing your engineering and your quality testing process? And then definitely, the bottom two, which is the operations and sales and health and medical records. I think, that is what was expected. And we can talk about, I can talk about the advantages of that.
Sure, Alpa. So in the industry, in the medical device industry, I work in medical device manufacturing. And so when you know, before you could actually manufacture a medical device, you have to engineer it and develop the design. And, you know, we all come from a background of lab notebooks and everything like that. But recently, well, in, you know, recent years, as the industry becomes worldwide and you're working with different companies in different locations, different geographies, it's helped to have everything on a digital platform so that you could collaborate across the country and across the world. And so that means that we're putting our engineering drawings on some a cloud system or some other web-based system so that we could share it and we could collaborate on designs, we could collaborate on test practices, test methodologies, and just, you know, actually putting it in a system that other people can access it so that it's not just paper-based. And it allows you to connect with other suppliers that may be better versed or in that technology, and you're able to expand your list of suppliers. Similarly, we're doing quality testing in the same realm, whereas before, if you're doing a test that you go inspect a little widget, dimension A, dimension B, and you're just writing the results on a test form, you know, a little digital, and then somebody has to go calculate whether that component passed the test, whether it was within range. There's more human error involved with that. You know, if somebody was looking at the dimension and they were supposed to test it out to 2 decimal points, if they did not round up or they did round up, and they weren't supposed to, that could lead to errors. And so lately, you know, there's different programs that could help you once you enter that data for the quality testing, it could spit out the result and make the conclusion for you as to whether that test sample or that dimension passed. So that's one way that we've been using quality testing and engineering testing in a technological platform and using that to our advantage so that we can get more consistency and be, you know, have reliability on those answers, on those test results. So that's how we use it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so, you know, as Jan explained, just having everything in your system, you know, the processes, if they are all integrated, you know, transferring data and transitioning data from one system to the other, I think it just kind of brings in more efficiencies, consistencies, data integrity. It just helps in releasing the product even more quicker, right? Because as Jan said, the more paper, the more, you know, having processes outside of the system, the more manual work you have to kind of consolidate the data. And, you know, in the next few topics, we're going to cover about the compliance as well. So we have to make sure that, you know, if the processes are all embedded in your integrated system, then it's easy to kind of stay on top of regulations and compliance that's required to release your products for medical device industries, for drug industries. So when we really kind of talk about operations and sales, and really I'm very impressed on the polling results on the health and medical records, I still run into my transaction deals where, you know, I see where the companies have their health records, medical records on paper, or they are in such different systems that has no integration or no connection. And then again, you know, there are so many manual processes that they have built or they develop outside of those systems. And then that's just increasing more manual work, more hands that get in there and, you know, more prone to errors as well. I just recently closed a deal where the clinic, the target was in healthcare clinic, and they had about 4 locations across the U.S. And sure enough, we learned is all of their medical records are actually on paper, and they physically archive those documents in a storage. So they're physically stored in boxes, and they put those records over there. And so if you really want to go through, you know, any old records, you have to kind of go in there and, you know, kind of go through the alphabetical boxes and kind of pull up medical records and health records. And so one of the biggest projects that we executed for them was to digitize using robotic process automation, digitize all those records. So I think just in a nutshell, what we're trying to highlight here is technology being a platform, especially in life sciences, where it's necessary for you to release your products on time. It's necessary to make sure you test your products on time. It's necessary to make sure that you're regulated and you're staying compliant. It's always advantageous to really have all your processes embedded in an integrated system. And the more digitized, the more efficiencies, the more consistencies you can bring in this process. And that just kind of makes your overall workload and your business operations more seamless and more smooth. We are now going to move to our next next topic. This section is really kind of leading into what I just discussed about having an integrated system, having your processes executed, using technology, and eliminating all the manual processes or doing all the paperwork. What it helps, how it helps, and also kind of talking about the systems that's going to support your engineering, your qualities, your regulations, your compliance. So the next question that I'm going to ask is related around these topics, and then let's see, what we hear from you guys. So we have 30 seconds for this question as well. So I have 5 more seconds. All right, let's see the results. This is really good. This is what we were expecting and hoping to hear, that you have a dedicated compliance or quality role at your organization. Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about, having a dedicated, compliance and a quality resource that's just dedicated on making sure that, that supports our organization? Can you share your thoughts on just, what their day-to-day role is, what they really focus on? And, let's also talk about, what really kind of responsibilities they have, and, keeping that technology and integrated technology in mind, how this really helps us and supports us in our organization.
Okay. So my role has been quality systems, or called regulatory compliance. And so one of the things I do is, before we actually design a medical product, we have to look at the FDA and the international requirements and the regulations surrounding that product. If it's a blood oxygenator, if it's a heart valve, what are the requirements as to how it needs to perform, whether there's any other systems it needs to integrate with. And so we assess all those requirements. There are regulatory requirements. So there might be something like a product requirement that says, you're not going to go make the medical device out of something that may not be compatible with the body. So you have to test it for biocompatibility, and, it has to be able to be sterilizable, and it has to, so you look at what the requirements are. It has to be able to be implanted for this length of time. Also, then you have to look at the systems that are required to manufacture the product. So, you can't just throw something together. You have to then design it. You have to test it. You have to document all the how you designed it. You have to document how you manufactured it. You have to document how you trained the personnel on how to manufacture it. So all of those requirements come from regulations. They come from FDA regulations, and they come from the international regulations. So before we even have a concept of what the product is, we have to look at those regulatory requirements, and we then create a system that says, okay, now we're going to look at this. It needs to be sterilizable. Let's consider this. It needs to be biocompatible. What materials can we use? We need to have this sort of a system that has electronic controls where you have double signature, double verification. So each of those requirements are then taken in and recorded and communicated to the appropriate personnel. So then, and then my job then, after identifying all those regulations and communicating them to the appropriate personnel, then afterwards, I have to make sure I verify that the systems were set up and we considered each of those regulations. Like, okay, let me see the report that shows that you assessed it for biocompatibility. Let me see the report that shows that you did packaging testing, that it can have, maybe the requirement is a 2-year shelf life on the product. Did you test it and verify that the product has a 2-year shelf life? Did you, you state that personnel who are going to perform this specific operation can't just train, read the procedure. They have to be certified to perform that operation. So I go verify that all of those were done. So after you've designed it, you've manufactured it to a specific set of regulations. The world of regulatory requirements, they're constantly changing, they're evolving. As we learn new things, we get new regulatory requirements. So the role then also makes sure that you are looking and you're involved with all the platforms and the websites where they communicate changes. Okay, this ISO standard is being changed. You have 3 years to implement those processes across your company. There's new requirements then to market in Europe. What you need to do beforehand, how you assess the risk. As each of those regulations come up, my role as regulatory compliance is then to go look at the regulations, see how they've changed. Again, basically go back to all the people and say, this is how the regulations changed. I need you to update your system and incorporate those new requirements. And, and if it's something like, if it's paper-based, you may just be updating a procedure. But then if it's software-based, you need to then go work with the developer of the software and make sure that that software or that platform is evolving so that you can have a space to consider or do that evaluation and document that new requirement that you had not planned for when you originally started your project. So that's how we use the technology and take regulatory requirements and implement them, and then just communicate them to everybody and make sure it's captured in our platform, whatever technological platform we're using. So each of those, you take those new sometimes they're user requirements, sometimes they're product requirements, sometimes they're regulatory requirements. You embed them into that system, whether it's a procedure or a software system, and you roll it out to the organization so that everybody could basically be on the same page in how we're executing the requirements. So
Jan,
that's our role.
Jan, where does privacy and security regulation, as we've seen it explode in the past few years, where does that fit into what you're doing and who you work with?
For me, a lot of what I work with is in the manufacturing and design side, but then a lot of what I'm doing is we're still developing and manufacturing the product. But as we get to clinical studies and we develop our clinical software programs where we, work with the investigational sites and work with clinical subjects, that's where we have to make sure that the clinical subjects identification is protected, so that if you're going to take those clinical results and report them to the FDA or report them to a regulatory body in support of a new clinical development, new product, you need to protect those. Also on the other side, there's I work in the high risk devices, meaning implants, like implantable cardiac defibrillators, glaucoma implant stents. For those, you also have a traceability requirement where you basically know the end user who got the implant in case there's an issue. Well, now you have that patient information who, you have to be able to know who to contact if there's an issue with the product, but yet you have to be able to protect that information, that it's not just, it doesn't get hacked, right? The cybersecurity, you have that patient information in case there's a recall or a notification that needs to go out. But then we have to make sure that that side of it is protected so that the rest of the organization who's doing the sales and distribution does not see that final traceability information. So probably 90% of what I do does not go into the realm of patient information, because that's at the very last step, and that's actually distribution and sales or the clinical study. But I do a lot with the manufacturing of the device or the design of the device and the systems that the people within that manufacturing building work in. But we do have that small aspect at the end that we have to make sure the clinical and the sales information is protected.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good distinction to make between the development and the design, which some privacy and security gets built into their like capabilities to encrypt or mask or whatever the case may be. But a lot of it is on the end, and they're two separate roles. So I think that kind of moves us into kind of our next, I think we have a polling question. And more specifically, do you have a dedicated compliance role for these regulatory items like privacy and security, separate from kind of what Jan has explained? Does that pull up, Alpa? I'm sorry.
No problem. I think my screen's frozen.
It's up. The poll's up.
Okay,
yep.
Great.
So again, we have 30 seconds for this question as well. We have 5 more seconds. All right, let's go to the results.
Good.
So this is...
Yes. We see a lot of folks that actually don't have a dedicated person looking at these things, rather maybe a team. And that's okay. Either one works. There's a way to look at it, but I think it's a good distinction and a good thing to build on from what Jan and Alpa have been talking about to discuss where does privacy and security fit in. It's a hot topic, obviously. We're seeing it in the news a lot. But how do we, build that into what we're doing already and make sure that we have privacy and security in mind when we're designing the product or solution, whatever that may be. So how do you balance these with getting to the market, getting to, revenue generating activities or getting the services out there? That's a big balancing act. And a lot of folks want to look at privacy and security and put in a lot of tools and technology to monitor, to protect, and think that they're good, but it is a process. And the way I really like to think about it is starting with, what's the worst possible scenario? It's losing data, data leaks, or business disruption, or an issue with something that you mentioned, Jan, one of the more sensitive products that goes inside, right? A device that goes inside of another person, and there's an issue with it. If that's a security or privacy issue, that's a big deal, right? So I think the place to start is governance and thinking about what are your what are the high risk processes and high risk, systems and devices that you offer that may carry either the most PHI or sensitive data, or that could affect those types of data, and start to build those processes around those of, okay, what is the business process that we use these for? How do we keep this data private? Meaning everybody needs a certain amount of sensitive data potentially to do their job. What do they need and what do they not need? What do the regulations tell us? There's GDPR in the EU. There's CCPA and CPRA, the updated version of the California Consumer Privacy Act. And there's all sorts of healthcare and HIPAA, and High Tech Act regulations that come into play. And I think we often think of the back-end systems, but when you think about devices and other things like that, the impact of technology can be huge. And regulation is a piece of that because you have to think through what do we need to change in our development, in our manufacturing, in our sales and marketing to make sure that we're keeping up with all of these things as we collect data, as we store data, as we delete data, hopefully when we don't need it anymore, or how long do we have to retain it for, and is that secure? So thinking about through those things is the place to kind of start and balance it with, those business priorities by looking at where are our most sensitive data sets and systems. What's the likelihood of those being affected by, security leak or security breach or privacy leak? And likelihood gets broken down into it could happen and the impact would be big, but what's the likelihood? So I think about, how many controls are in place to prevent or detect this and respond as quickly as possible? Or is that really the mode that attackers are going through? We still see a lot of phishing emails, but we do see direct attacks on certain systems if they're exposed to the internet per se. So, for example, thinking through those types of risks will help us understand what's most critical to pay attention to and put in those protections and protections via processes, and then have a technology or tool support that process. Putting in a technology to develop your process is always, I would not recommend that. It's not the best way to make sure that you have good protections in place around your technologies that you're using.
Yeah. And just to add to that, Stacy, just how you articulated the possibilities of, data breach, cyber breach, and, what precautions we can take from a technology perspective. Really, how you could protect your systems is by implementing, necessary tools and software like, sign-ons, single sign-ons, dual point authentication, VPNs, using these kind of technologies is also going to help you to protect your data and your system so they are not vulnerable to any cyber breach or data breach. I've come across, I'm sure Stacy as well, we've come across several deals where, we'll have, when we review the SOC report, we'll see that, what kind of controls are put in place. When you transfer the data from one system to other system, how is that data being transferred? How are you archiving the data? Is it encrypted? Is it decrypted? What kind of PI information is stored in your system? Is it hosted on the cloud? If it is, then we all know that once the data is hosted on the cloud, it's depending on if it's a public cloud, how you've protected your data that's hosted out there in the cloud. And all these can be addressed, and it's just making sure that you have the right level of security controls in place to make sure that your data is protected as well. So we don't run into any cyber breach issues. So that's just from a cyber perspective, how Stacy kind of talked about what your systems could be vulnerable to, how Jan kind of talked about, you want to know, what device is inserted into which patient, and you want to make sure that you have that visibility and to be able to track that, within your system, that something that was manufactured and, where it's going and where it's installed, is all possible when you really have like this integrated technology where you're executing, your production, your R&D, your manufacturing, your quality testing. So that's, again, just kind of emphasizing the significance of technology from IT risk security controls as well.
So, and I want to add on to that, Alpa, with thinking about, I mentioned risk and the likelihood of this sensitive data leak, and you may evaluate your systems and your security and privacy around those and think we've got them pretty well locked down, but the name of the game has changed and it's called ransomware, unfortunately. Yeah. And it doesn't care what kind of data you have, but it knows that you need to access your systems, so they're going to lock them up until you either pay or are able to get out of it. So that's something else to consider, to look through. And that's kind of moves us into one last poll I think we have. Has your organization experienced a security or privacy data leak or disruption? And once we look at the results of those, I'll talk a little bit more about different types that we've seen, particularly on privacy leaks as well.
Second starts now.
Thanks, Alpa.
No, thanks, Stacy. I think my screen just froze. I can't move the slides.
Oh, okay.
Five more seconds. And we are good.
Okay, good. Looks like a majority of you have, about 67%, which makes sense. We've seen it all. And that doesn't mean you have bad security or privacy necessarily. So given, enough time and resources, any attacker can potentially get into any system, including those that are encrypted and have,
Stacy, you froze.
Is Stacy?
I think
Stacy's having technical problems. Let me share something while we're waiting for Stacy to come back up. To Stacy's point, it's really, being exposed to cyber breach, data breach, doesn't necessarily mean that, we don't have the necessary IT controls in place. We don't have the proper, are you back, Stacy?
Yes, sorry about that.
All right, no problem. I was just continuing on, but why don't I let you take it from here?
Yeah, so cyber and privacy's impact on business is definitely visible. We can all see it. It's in the news. We've all seen the major breaches, the ransomware notices. But how do these happen? What are the most common attack vectors and what are the results? And where do you start with how to prevent or reduce the impact, at least, of these? I mentioned, given enough time and resources, any attacker could get into any system. It is possible. And if you go under that assumption, it's really assumption of breach is what we call it. It's not if, it's when. I'm sure some of you maybe heard that adage now. The most popular way is still phishing emails because it is very cheap and inexpensive for the attackers to use. Send one email to thousands of people, and it only takes one to get into an organization potentially. We see that for ransomware. We see that for business email compromise, which means just getting into an email, spoofing maybe an executive and asking somebody to wire something. A lot of those are started by phishing. There are external vulnerabilities that are compromised, meaning things that are web-facing that anybody can scan. If it does have vulnerabilities that can be exploited and aren't monitored, then I think those are also popular attack methods as well. But another one I think is privacy leak. We've seen a lot of incorrect, sending out emails to the wrong person. If you have autofill on your email and you meant to send it to, Stacy Smith instead of Stacy Scott, you're going to send potentially sensitive information somewhere that you don't mean to. So paying attention to those email leaks is really, I think, a big deal. How do you filter those out? How do you make sure that that sensitive data is encrypted or masked or deleted if not necessary? Another way is people using outside storage methods when they can't send it via email or don't have a safe or secure and encrypted way to send information to external parties. That's another big way of privacy leak that we see quite a bit. So thinking through those types of things, you know, what's a girl to do? How do you, what do you attack first, right, from your cyber and privacy program? And I would look at what you have to do from a regulatory perspective. What do you have to have in place? What are those processes? But also take a look more heavily on your monitoring systems and your ability to respond to any of those alerts. You may have it outsourced. That's absolutely okay. Make sure you have good communication with those third parties that are monitoring your systems for you, with monitoring security alerts and privacy alerts. There's tools that do all these things. There's services that provide these things. And while you're looking to get better and more sophisticated protections in place, encryption, data identification, things like that, make sure you can at the very least be able to detect something that is a potential security or privacy risk or that could impact your business, and alert and make sure someone's responding to those as quickly as possible. The name of the game is not thinking that this will never happen. It's when it does, we're able to respond quickly and reduce the impact. So maybe not even require notification or doesn't disrupt business. That's the goal, which with the assumption of breach kind of school of thought, and thinking through those things. I think that's a good place to focus for a lot of folks. And it starts with governance. Who's going to do what? Are we practicing? Are we training? Are we communicating? Do we practice that communication? Because in an event, in an incident or a potential incident, there's a lot of emotions and there's a lot of, it's high stakes. So a lot of people get nervous, and you want to have a well-practiced process for people to follow, whether that's with technology or without. How do they alert? How do you get your end users, your front line, to alert to you? So I think the impact obviously is quite huge on business because it requires new system requirements. It requires new processes and knowing where all of your data is located, how it's protected, who has access to it. And if from a privacy perspective, how do you take care of, those patient rights and consumer rights of, I want you to tell me where all my data is. I want it deleted, the data portability things. That takes a lot of, resources to do, and it's not something easily outsourced, but the services to do it definitely can be. But someone who understands where all the data is really impacts those in business, in operations, in revenue generating service lines. It really impacts their day-to-day because they're the users of the data and they know the best where that is. So the impact is obviously huge, but there's ways to manage it. And I think the biggest way is to make sure you know where that data is and know how you're monitoring any disruption or leak of that data and where it's going as best as possible, and you're able to respond to it. Alpa or Jan, any thoughts, any experiences you've had that you want to share?
Yeah, just to add to that, Stacy, I think, you kind of talked about, what part of your system and process is vulnerable. But, we kind of, if Stacy and her team kind of identifies, the vulnerability, what we do is we kind of provide measures and we implement systems and tools like we do dark web testing, stress testing, get your system SOC certified. That essentially will help you, which is, something that we recommend as part of industry practices, to get your systems certified every quarter or at least twice a year, so how well your systems are protected. Try to understand the backups, the disaster recovery, how often the data is backed up, what part of the data is encrypted, decrypted, how is it accessed? Is it accessed directly by logging into the system, or is it accessed by dual authentication that's required, which is, the new technology these days. Even when you have commercial off-the-shelf softwares, having access to the data, making sure that your system's protected, making sure that they're SOC certified, your processes are SOC certified, your governance, data governance and controls are well defined and certified, making sure that you're periodically executing stress testing and dark web testing, staying on top of it and then kind of, executing these measures is good enough. Will tell you, where you are in terms of technology, how you need to address them, and you can probably take care of this and take care of any issues in a timely fashion and reduce any potential risk of, that's sometimes embedded in your systems and your infrastructure. So, Jen, do you have anything you want to add, and any of your experiences that you want to share?
So I want to take it a little bit step back of what you've both discussed, both what Stacy and Alpa have discussed. So one of the things we do is when we actually acquire or look at new systems that, what's the process that we want to move to a software platform and a digital platform, we look at the requirements of how we want to use it. What is it going to be used for? Is it going to be used for document control, change management, training? So we look at all the aspects. So we define what the user requirements, what the system requirements, and I think you bring up a good point, because typically we're only looking at, well, how do you want the software to be used? But one aspect that we should also consider when we set up that user requirements grid and defining how we want to use it is that, okay, how am I going to use this? Is this a closed system that's just used within my company? Are we putting this on the cloud? And one of the requirements when you do a software validation is you define all the requirements, meaning the protections, the risk, and then what are the risks of each of those? And we do a risk assessment of each requirement. Let's say if this functionality that we wanted, the protection, or, one of the functions we want it to be able to launch training. Okay, that's one of the requirements. What's the risk of that function if it doesn't work correctly? What's the risk of the impact of that to your organization? So each of those get assessed for the risk, and then you have to identify how you will try to address that risk. So if you have a risk and you're identifying it up front, that there may be a ransomware attack or there may be data vulnerability, it's helpful to actually have all those risks defined up front so that you can identify whether that's software or whether you can implement some sort of controls. The controls may be a firewall or a VPN or the double authentication, and I think, as we're saying this, I think it's important. And like I said, typically we only look at the functionality of the system or the platform, but we should be also looking at, is this data getting backed up? How are we protecting it from other people accessing it? Are we requiring passwords to be changed every 30 days or 90 days or something like that? So not only because if the risk of the failure of that attribute is high to your organization, you need to address it, whether you're testing it or putting in some controls that will address that risk. If it's a high risk, if it's patient information, if it's whatever that is. But I think that's important to consider that up front when you are assessing and trying to acquire the software platform or where you want to load it, and a part of that also is assessing the supplier who's providing it to you. Is the supplier who's providing that system, do they have the appropriate certifications in place? Are they ISO certified for some of those software regulations that are out there? Do they have the systems where they're checking certain things, so I think that's important that we take that all the way, not look at that at the very end, but you need to look at it at the very beginning of what system you're purchasing, where you're going to put it, how is it going to be used? Is it just internally on your own company server, or is it going to be in the cloud, or just things like that? I think up front to actually address what Stacy has said about the cyber and the privacy. You can't really build it in at the end. You have to consider that up front as to how it's going to be used. And you have to assess that risk appropriately.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jan. And I want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A function in the presentation here. But Jan, you just addressed one of the questions, which was, how do you build privacy and security into the design of what you're doing? And I think it's slowly, you just described it, it's moving up and up the chain to think about where is this data going to go and what capabilities do we build into there, whether it's, encryption and all the other stuff that you mentioned, allowable to do, single sign-on. Alpa or Jan, any examples of whether you had to go back to design or something that, that commonly comes into play from a security and privacy perspective in designing a new product?
Jan, we can give so many instances. That Jan and I, we worked on a systems implementation project in our previous lives. And, obviously we went through the methodical process of software selection where we shortlisted, the software that would fit our industry, our company, our operations. And then we went through the design. Sure enough, every software is probably going to claim that their software fits the best and is going to fulfill all the industry needs and the processes. And I think it was in our second test cycle when we were trying to run through some of the scenarios, and we noticed that when we were testing those scenarios and we were validating, so we were executing the test scenarios and Jan's team was validating, and that's when we noticed that, we were actually able to ship an expired product. And again, all that goes into, holistically, when we are looking at technology, we're looking at the software that fits our business need. We need to look at, not only from our process perspective, how it's going to fit in our business processes and how we're going to execute our day-to-day jobs. We need to look at where the data is going to be hosted. We need to look at, whether it's a cloud or an on-prem system. We need to look at, what security controls come embedded in the system, because, you'll see all these systems with all the open connectivities and APIs to interface with other systems. We need to consider not only just the design aspect of the system, but, the security control as well, because this data via interface is now going to transfer from one system to the other system, and how the data is encrypted and how the data is transmitted. That's something, because even the interfaces that we build can be hosted on cloud or can be on-prem as well. With just so much of technology advancements, we really have to start looking at, not only the system that will fit our business need, but the infrastructure as well, and where the application's hosted, and how we are going to be able to protect our clients' data, our customers' data, so that, we don't run into these kind of issues and don't patch the system trying to address, one issue at a time. Just overall holistically look at the infrastructure and the architecture. The other thing I can share,
actually, can I add one thing to that? When you're talking about infrastructure, one thing that came up with that project that, when you're doing your testing and you're doing your system setup, you're testing it on your computer monitor and your computer systems. Well, some of those uses nowadays, especially if you're in the healthcare world, sales reps are accessing the information on their cell phone. Physicians are accessing the information on their tablets, on their iPads. And, you have to consider each of those potential breach areas, because it may have been that, okay, you tested it on your computer and you had to go through certain encryptions and VPN, but all of a sudden, you have these iPads that are at the point of use and you didn't test for it. You didn't test for the controls, for the security breach, and for that infrastructure. So nowadays it's really important that, you may consider one way to use it. You tested it on your computer system, but then the sales rep's out in the field and he's pulling it up on his phone through the, the web-based Safari or something. And then, maybe you only tested it on an iPhone and this other sales rep has it on his Samsung. So I think those infrastructures now, you may not consider that up front, but it's so much more important now of where we're seeing it with healthcare information and how people are accessing stuff, accessing it while you're in the airport, while you're on your iPad or something else. And,
Yep.
so that could lead to some of those, and they do need to be considered up front. One of the products that I worked on was an implantable cardiac defibrillator, and the physician would be able to read your EKG on their cell phone. So just think of the protections and the data encryption so that you can't access somebody else's personal information so these controls that need to be locked in. So just up front, all those consider the different infrastructures and platforms that are being used that you did not originally intend and you didn't design for.
That makes sense. And we've got about 9 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to this question. If you're looking at, off the shelf commercial, systems, whether it's infrastructure or, at the level, and you're going to build onto it, what are the key things that you guys look for now, especially as it relates to cyber and privacy, but any other kind of, you mentioned, obviously you got to look for the business and business processes that you're looking to automate or implement there. But what specifically around these things would you say are your top 3 that you would pick to look through and compare different vendors with?
I'll give my thoughts, and Jen, add to it. Interestingly, what we do these days is, it's not just technology that supports and can help execute our business processes, but it's looking at, can it have, our regulation requirements? Can it have our compliance requirements? Does the system, where is it hosted? Is it going to be hosted on a public cloud, or can we actually host it on our private cloud? There are just so many aspects these days that we have to keep in mind. Even when you are within the organization storing the data, and Jan can relate to this, is when you're storing the data, because when we are storing patients' information, we were going through that systems implementation, that data, when person A accesses, when it's the same person in that organization, he's part of the organization, when he accesses that data versus, someone higher up is able to access that data, they're going to see 2 different views. All that is leading into, the kind of software that you pick can really do that, because, making that possible in a software where it can fulfill your business requirements, but not regulation or compliance, you just have to, patch the system with more customization. The more customization, the more interfaces, the more vulnerability of sending data from one infrastructure to another, right? From one vendor to another vendor. So holistically, today, we kind of look at, the entire footprint of applications from an infrastructure, regulation, compliance, making sure that it supports all these processes, data protection as well. And, like, for example, we just did another project where we built a portal just for communication with the patient and the doctor. And to build that portal, again, which is very rare, we find, commercial off-the-shelf softwares. So you really have to kind of build these softwares and these applications and keep in mind. And that's really when you have more flexibility, because this is something that you're building from ground up zero. And it's just sort of a portal communication between the patient and the doctor. Again, had to keep everything in mind as, are we going to host that data from the clinic? Where is the data going to reside? Are we going to put in all the securities and controls? Is it going to be on cloud? How can we access that data? Can doctor access that data when they're in the clinic, or can doctor access that data when they are home, or can they access it from their web iPhones or cell phones, right? So that's just something we just kind of keep in mind when we are kind of looking at the systems that we choose for the life sciences, specifically for this industry.
Yeah.
Jen, do you want to add?
Let me see if I can sum up what you just kind of said. I think I would say it's access and how can you control and configure that after you figure out who's going to access it and where. But also, how do you protect data at rest and how do you protect data in transit? Those top three, meaning communication, where's it going? What are our configuration capabilities to lock that down and make sure that's secure, to send it to different systems, to different users in or outside of the organization? I think those are maybe three things, to think through is access, and then data protections at rest and data protections in transit, I'll call it. Jan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I agree that, you have to look at those, how it's going to be used, who needs to access it, what's the role and the access level that you give them. And then sometimes if the software doesn't have the capability to lock some of that down, you may end up having to put a secondary control over it, like you mentioned before, maybe a VPN that limits only certain people and they have to use a double system to try to get to the software. So if the software doesn't have that capability, there might be something that you have to do externally to limit that access to the software.
Very good point.
Yep.
Yes, very good point.
So, all right.
Any questions related to technology, cyber, IT risk security controls? I mean, I think we covered quite a bit, really, Stacy, Jen, Tommy, we kind of talked about, having an integrated system where you can execute all your key functions like engineering, R&D, quality testing. What are the advantages? What's the benefit of having an integrated system? Talking about efficiencies and consistencies, maintaining your regulation in the system. And then really we kind of covered, just the cyber breach, security, risks, controls. That's really what kind of we want to, if you kind of summarize, that's really the part of the technology we wanted to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for your input. Thank you for your questions. I hope you've enjoyed today's session. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us. But stay tuned. There's another presentation coming up next. And thank you all for joining today. Thanks, Alpa. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
Thanks.